April 1946. Dawn drifts pale over the rolling farmlands of Iowa. The snowmelt leaves a sheen of silver across the barbed wire fences encircling Camp Algona, one of America's largest prisoner compounds. Inside the compound, hundreds of German women, former auxiliaries, nurses, typists, and anti-aircraft helpers, stand in formation for roll call. They have been told this is their final week in captivity. Within days, trucks will arrive to take them to ships bound for a homeland in ruins. Yet a strange stillness fills the yard. No cheering, no laughter. Only the creak of boots on frost and the faint hiss of wind through the watchtower slats were recorded by an army clerk that morning. Preserved in the U.S. Provost Marshal General reports. 1946. These women had arrived a year earlier, some captured in Normandy, others in Italy or along the shattered front near the Rhine. When the European War ended, most expected immediate repatriation. Instead, administrative chaos and Allied labor shortages kept thousands in the United States for months. By 1946, America had grown used to its temporary guests. The locals called them the polite Germans. They sewed uniforms for U.S. depots, harvested corn, and repaired military tents. In return, they received 3 meals a day, medical care, and letters delivered weekly. Under the Geneva Convention's Article 36, conditions far removed from the hunger-haunting Germany, the paradox became visible when officers announced the impending releases. Interpreters noted murmurs of hesitation rippling through the ranks. Some women whispered of staying. Others cried quietly, holding letters describing missing families, vanished homes, and Soviet occupation zones. The camp psychologist, Captain Howard R. King, documented the moment as a collective emotional paralysis in his post-war survey archived by the Army Medical Department Historical Division. The American guards, hardened by years of combat, were stunned. These prisoners did not want to go home. To understand their reluctance, one must return to the last months of the Reich. In 1945, as Berlin collapsed, tens of thousands of women had been pressed into auxiliary roles. They operated radios, plotted aircraft, or drove ambulances under bombardment. Many had been told that capture by the Allies meant certain abuse or death. Propaganda films screamed warnings of enemy enslavement. Yet, when captured by advancing U.S. units, they discovered something entirely different. At camps like Reims, Cherbourg, and later the transatlantic holding sites, the Americans offered rations, blankets, and even dental care. Records confirm 2.3 million medical treatments administered to POWs between 1945 and 1946, U.S. Army Surgeon General Statistical Review. For women accustomed to shortages and terror, captivity felt almost surreal. By summer 1945, several ships bearing female prisoners had crossed the Atlantic. Their journey was documented aboard transports such as the SS Argentina and SS Thomas H. Berry. The voyage logs describe orderly decks, Red Cross inspections, and the sound of gramophones playing swing music below. When they disembarked in Virginia and New York, photographers from Signal Corps Unit 1851 captured women stepping onto American soil in pressed uniforms, staring at skyscrapers rising from fog. Some smiled nervously. Others looked terrified. They were processed, deloused, assigned serial numbers, and placed in compounds across the Midwest, Michigan, Kansas, and Iowa, chosen for distance from the coasts and for agricultural labor opportunities. Life inside those barbed boundaries soon acquired rhythm. At dawn, bugles sounded. By mid-morning, columns of German women marched towards sewing sheds or farm trucks under escort. Local farmers quickly realized the skill and discipline of these unexpected workers. In letters preserved in county archives, American families describe the quiet girls who never complained. They learned English phrases, good morning, thank you, coffee please. On Sundays, Lutheran pastors visited. Choirs formed. Newspapers later reported that a Christmas concert in 1945 drew hundreds of townspeople, amazed by the harmonies drifting from the camp chapel. A converted mess hall with hand-painted stars along the rafters, Algona, Upper Des Moines Gazette. January 1946. Comfort, however, brought confusion. Every privilege reminded them of what had been lost. Germany, they read in censored letters, lay in ashes. Food rations measured 1,200 calories a day. Cities like Hamburg were skeletons. Families were displaced or trapped in Soviet sectors. The women at Camp Algona compared these reports to the steaming stew and warm cots they enjoyed each night. Private Anneliese Gruber wrote to a friend in Munich that the prison is the only place I have ever been treated as a human being. That letter, later translated in the U.S. War Department's censorship review files, became emblematic of a silent moral dissonance spreading among the prisoners. American officers noticed the unease. Major William Delaney, commanding the camp, instructed interpreters to reassure the women that Germany's reconstruction had begun and that the world outside awaited them. Yet rumors persisted. Soviet troops committing atrocities in the East, hunger riots in the West, black markets, and occupation police. Why leave safety? One translator remembered a nurse asking during interviews later used in the University of Iowa oral history collection. To many, captivity no longer symbolized defeat. It represented survival. Meanwhile, locals had grown attached to them. A 1946 letter from the town's mayor to the War Department thanked the camp for improving local harvest yield by 30%. American families invited German workers to picnics. Friendships, and sometimes forbidden romances, emerged quietly. Guards often turned a blind eye. Yet every connection deepened the dread of separation. When the order came to prepare for transport, some prisoners feigned illness. Others petitioned for extended duty. The army denied every request, citing repatriation policy. But behind the paperwork, officers debated what to do with women who claimed they had no home to return to. One internal memo, found in Provost Marshal Circular No. 27, admitted, repatriation of female personnel is complicated by socio-political instability and psychological dependency on the camp environment. As spring advanced, trucks arrived. The prisoners packed their few belongings, letters, handmade dresses, and snapshots of American friends. Witnesses recall tears and even fainting spells. An Iowa journalist who attended the first departure convoy described faces as pale as the morning sky, turning backward toward the gates as if to memorize their cages. Those cages had once symbolized shame. Now they represented order, certainty, and warmth. In Germany, the situation they feared was real. Postwar surveys by the International Refugee Organization revealed that nearly one-third of repatriated women POWs faced homelessness upon arrival. Many were stigmatized as traitors or collaborators, accused of fraternizing with the enemy. Some were assaulted or denied ration cards. Those still in America heard rumors through delayed letters and clandestine radio snippets. The dread deepened. When the second convoy was announced in late April, 30 women signed a collective statement pleading for postponement, citing emotional unfitness to travel. The camp doctor noted the request but received a curt order: proceed as scheduled. That final week of April became a haunting tableau. Inside the camp chapel, women knelt in prayer while American guards dismantled perimeter lighting. The Stars and Stripes was lowered each evening with solemn ceremony. Even the guard dogs, once restless, seemed subdued. One sergeant, years later, told the Veterans Oral Memory Project that he had never seen prisoners so sorrowful to leave captivity. The paradox echoed through every barrack. Freedom had become the new uncertainty. Captivity the only stability left. On the morning of departure, mist blanketed the fields. Engines rumbled. The convoy gates swung open, steel groaning against frost. From the towers, guards watched as the women climbed aboard the olive-drab trucks, clutching satchels and photographs. The line moved slowly toward the road, where the horizon glowed pink beneath the rising sun. In the stillness, one question lingered, unspoken yet palpable through every trembling breath. What if home no longer existed? That question would not fade when the ships set sail. It would follow across the Atlantic, shadowing every mile toward a devastated continent, and soon expose the deeper reason these women dreaded liberty itself, a truth born not of politics or propaganda, but of human psychology shaped by war's inversion of safety and fear. To understand why freedom felt like exile, the story must now cross the ocean, to the shattered towns of a defeated Germany and to the engineers, doctors, and officers trying to rebuild souls as well as cities. The ships steamed eastward across the Atlantic under a low ceiling of gray. The SS Argentina carried nearly 900 German women, its decks cold with sea spray and silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay a homeland many no longer recognized. Below deck, the rhythmic hum of the engines mixed with the scraping of enamel mugs and the occasional sob muffled beneath a wool blanket. One American escort officer noted in his voyage log that morale remained subdued. No expressions of joy, only quiet resignation. The women were heading home. Yet not one appeared eager to arrive. The journey lasted 12 days. During the crossing, American Red Cross nurses distributed reading materials, Life magazines, worn English primers, and copies of the New York Times. Some prisoners studied the photographs, smiling American families, gleaming cars, and neon signs. The contrast between these images and the ruins awaiting them produced visible distress. They stare at the pictures as if they were fiction, one nurse later recalled in a medical corps debriefing. When storm winds battered the ship on the 8th night, several women confessed to feeling that the voyage itself was punishment, a forced transition from order into chaos. The U.S. escort commander, Captain Harold L. Morris, filed a psychological observation suggesting institutional dependency brought on by extended humane captivity. When the convoy finally docked at Le Havre, the port was a skeleton of twisted cranes and collapsed warehouses. French officials, still bitter from the occupation, supervised the transfer with minimal warmth. The German women were herded onto trains marked Repatriated, bound for the British and American occupation zones. Through the shattered windows, they saw the continent their memories could not reconcile. Bridges like torn ribs over black rivers. Children scavenging in rubble, hollow-eyed civilians lining tracks with pails for food scraps. A photographer from British Army Public Relations captured an image of one prisoner pressing her hand to the glass, eyes wide, as if watching the future vanish upon arrival in Germany. The illusion of home broke instantly. Camps that once housed Allied POWs now held returning Germans for processing. The women underwent interrogation by combined intelligence objectives teams screening for Nazi affiliations. Some were identified as former Luftwaffe auxiliaries or members of the Reich Labor Service. Their American-issued coats and boots drew envy and suspicion from civilians outside the fences. "We were prisoners again," wrote former clerk Irmgard Reuter in a 1947 letter archived by the German Federal Archives Koblenz. Only this time, the barbed wire was in our minds. The transition from the structured life of an American camp to the anarchy of occupied Germany proved traumatic. Psychologists later described it as reversal shock. Inside U.S. camps, daily routines, work, meals, recreation had created predictability. In Germany, nothing was predictable. Housing was scarce, employment non-existent, and family ties shattered by displacement or death. Anneliese Gruber, the nurse who once described her captivity as humane, arrived in Munich to find her home flattened. Her parents were missing. She slept in a cellar with strangers and wrote in a small notebook, later preserved in the Munich Historical Institute. "At night, I dream of the camp. I smell coffee and hear English voices. I wake to dust." The Americans had unwittingly built an environment of psychological security, sustained by order and decency. For many women, the structured captivity had served as therapy after the trauma of war. They had rules, supervision, and clear hierarchies, conditions absent in post-war Germany. A U.S. Army psychiatrist who reviewed female POW cases in 1946 concluded that extended humane internment may have substituted institutional safety for national identity. His report for the Army Service Forces Rehabilitation branch warned that returning such individuals to chaos could produce reactionary withdrawal or nostalgia for captivity. Economically, the contrast was even sharper. During captivity, the women earned token wages redeemable at camp canteens stocked with chocolate, soap, and stationery. In Germany, food rations barely sustained life. Statistics from the Allied Control Council's Food Division show per capita daily caloric intake in early 1946 averaged 1,040 calories, half the nutritional minimum. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Women returning from American custody often arrived healthier than civilians, provoking resentment. Locals accused them of being spoiled by the enemy. One documented confrontation in Bremen ended violently when a repatriate wearing a U.S. jacket was struck by a crowd shouting "Ami girl," a bitter nickname implying collaboration. Behind the social hostility lay deeper psychological wounds. Many of these women had believed in Germany's wartime propaganda, only to have it dissolve under Captivity's civility. They had expected cruelty and found kindness. Now, faced with their own people's suspicion and the ruins of Hitler's promises, they were trapped between guilt and gratitude. Letters intercepted by occupation censors reveal a recurring theme: longing for the moral clarity of imprisonment. There, I knew who I was, a captive. Here, I am nothing, wrote one former telephonist from Stuttgart in correspondence now held by the U.S. Information Control Division. American and British administrators recognized the problem but could do little. Repatriation quotas had to be met. Yet, some officers proposed temporary reintegration centers to soften the shock. In the British zone, a pilot program at Hone Camp employed former POWs as clerks and translators. Reports from the Civil Affairs Section, 1946, note improved morale among women allowed to maintain structured duties. But funding and political priorities shifted toward denazification and economic recovery, leaving psychological rehabilitation largely unaddressed. Meanwhile, back in the United States, officers and guards from camps like Algona reflected uneasily on the departures. Major Delaney wrote to the Provost Marshal's office that the humane treatment mandated by Geneva may have created expectations no society could fulfill in post-war Germany. His words hinted at a moral paradox. By following international law faithfully, America had offered a glimpse of stability that the defeated nation could not yet provide. The irony became a topic in post-war symposiums on prisoner management at Fort Sam Houston, where military historians analyzed the American experiment in captivity. Among the repatriated women, nostalgia for that experiment deepened. Diaries recovered decades later described dreams of the camp gardens, of laughter during English lessons, and of the scent of American soap. One entry reads, "The smell of ivory soap is the smell of peace." This sensory fixation, noted by sociologists in the University of Frankfurt's 1952 POW study, reflected a psychological imprint akin to that of displaced children. Captivity, with its routines and boundaries, had offered a substitute family structure. Freedom offered none. The cultural stigma compounded their isolation. In the devastated towns, returning POWs were often labeled fallen women. Rumors circulated that female captives had been too friendly with American soldiers. Although official records show minimal misconduct, gossip replaced truth. Employers hesitated to hire them. Churches offered little comfort. One Lutheran pastor in Hamburg lamented in his parish register that the women returned with strange manners and foreign words, and the congregation does not forgive them. The very qualities that had kept them alive, adaptability, discipline, and acceptance of the enemy's decency, were recast as betrayal. Technically, the American detention system had been a triumph of organization. Engineers from the Quartermaster Corps had designed self-contained camps with sanitation, water purification, and heating far surpassing most European towns in 1945. Records from Army Corps of Engineers Field Report 78 list specifications down to pipe diameters and furnace models. These logistical feats inadvertently created psychological havens. When such ordered environments vanished upon release, the contrast was devastating. Sociologists later compared it to withdrawal from an addictive certainty, the camp as a controlled world insulated from chaos. It be why the winter of 1946. Many repatriated women were petitioning Allied offices for re-emigration to the United States. The U.S. Embassy Bonn archives holds dozens of such letters, humble and desperate. "We would work as nurses, maids, anything," one petition read. None were approved. Immigration quotas were strict, and public opinion would not have tolerated former enemy personnel returning. Still, the letters reveal the persistence of a quiet tragedy. Captivity had given them safety. Freedom denied it. And yet, beneath the grief, a subtle transformation began. In scattered villages, these women started forming aid committees, sharing rations, and teaching children English. The order they had learned behind fences became a blueprint for rebuilding. A British Observer in Civil Affairs report, Number 112 noted that female repatriates from U.S. custody display higher organizational aptitude and hygiene discipline. What had begun as dependency evolved, slowly, into resilience. The paradox of their refusal to embrace freedom began to resolve into something else, the ability to redefine it. Still, the image of those final convoys from Camp Algona lingered, a symbol of captivity's strange comfort and liberty's cruel uncertainty. As Germany struggled to rise, the question persisted among soldiers and scholars alike. Had these women truly been freed, or merely displaced from one form of control to another? That question would follow into the next years as psychologists, military planners, and the women themselves wrestled with an uncomfortable conclusion that the human mind, when faced with total collapse, may cling to captivity not out of weakness, but out of the desperate need for order in a world rebuilt from ashes. In that fragile rebirth, the true legacy of their refusal would begin, not in defeat, but in the quiet reconstruction of dignity itself. By 1947, the war was gone, but its shadow lingered in every alley, every church ruin, and every whispered story of what had been lost. Across the Allied zones of Germany, the former female POWs tried to rebuild their lives. But the memory of captivity, its order, its civility, its routines, did not vanish. It haunted them quietly, shaping their choices, their marriages, and their children's upbringing. Sociologists of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Morale Division would later describe this as the persistence of the camp mindset, a psychological architecture built from discipline, dependency, and gratitude toward the very nation that once held them behind wired in the American zone. Reconstruction began slowly. The Marshall Plan was still a whisper in political offices. Hunger still ruled the streets. For the women who had come from places like Camp Algona or Fort Oglethorpe, the disarray of post-war Germany felt like a moral void. They remembered the cleanliness of the barracks, the punctuality off meals, and the dignity of labor under supervision. In the ruins of Munich and Kassel, such things were dreams. Many clung to their camp habits, folding clothes with military precision, lining up shoes beneath makeshift beds, and addressing local clerks with "sir." When American occupation officers visited refugee shelters, they often remarked on the peculiar orderliness of former female POWs. The records filed with Military Government Detachment H-32 show that, even in freedom, they carried America's discipline into the wreckage. But order alone could not fill the emptiness. For many, captivity had been the first time they experienced fairness uncorrupted by ideology. Within the fences, race, class, and propaganda had lost meaning. Outside, prejudice and politics returned with a vengeance. A few of the women found work as translators or typists for the U.S. military government. They typed ration reports, transcribed interrogations, and managed logistics for displaced persons. Their fluency in English and their familiarity with American procedures made them indispensable. The prisoners of yesterday, one colonel wrote in a letter now held by the National Archives College Park, are the administrators of today. Yet, even these small victories deepened the moral contradiction. To serve the occupier was to survive, but it also branded them collaborators in the eyes of their countrymen. Psychologists studying these cases began to grasp the deeper pattern. The Allied Control Commission's Psychological Service conducted interviews with 112 repatriated female POWs in late 1947. The findings, declassified decades later, revealed a startling uniformity. Over half described their captivity in positive or formative terms. Many reported feelings of anxiety or loss of identity after release. The American analyst, Dr. Robert P. Warren, concluded that prolonged exposure to humane captivity had conditioned the subjects to equate structure with safety. It was a finding that unsettled moral certainties on both sides of the Atlantic. Could compassion in war produce dependence in peace? Could victory's mercy, extended too long, blur the line between captor and guardian? Meanwhile, stories filtered across the Atlantic. American veterans who had served as camp guards wrote memoirs recalling the quiet dignity of the women they once watched over. Newspapers in the 1950s revisited the POW program as an example of the American way of peace. Yet for the women themselves, the narrative remained tangled. Few spoke publicly. Shame lingered. Shame of defeat, shame of survival, and shame of preferring captivity to freedom. The stigma silenced them. In villages where they settled, they became invisible. Teachers, midwives, clerks, carrying a secret history behind polite smiles. Only in private diaries, decades later, did their memories resurface. The morning fog at Algona, the warmth of coffee, the feeling of safety in a place that was never meant to be home. The paradox fascinated military planners studying Cold War psychology. During the Korean War, U.S. analysts cited the German women's experience in internal memos from the Army Psychological Warfare Center as evidence that humane treatment could yield ideological stability. They argued that kindness, not coercion, produced lasting control. The POW program had demonstrated an unexpected truth. Captivity governed by decency could become more powerful than captivity enforced by fear. It was a lesson both ethical and unsettling, influencing doctrines of re-education and counterinsurgency for decades. The Algona model, as it was quietly called in one 1953 policy draft, showed that moral power could outlast physical walls for the women who had lived it, though the legacy was more personal. As West Germany rose from rubble, many began channeling their disciplined habits into civic work. Former camp nurses became hospital administrators. Seamstresses from the camp workshops founded cooperatives that supplied uniforms to new German police forces. Their sense of duty, honed under the watchful eyes of American guards, became the invisible spine of a society learning democracy. One sociologist from the University of Heidelberg Institute for Social Research observed that female repatriates from U.S. camps show higher rates of civic participation and institutional trust. It was as if the fences that once confined them had later become frameworks for rebuilding order out of anarchy. Still, the emotional residue remained. In letters preserved by families, one reads, "Freedom came without instruction." Another writes, "We were freed into emptiness." These testimonies expose a truth often omitted from victory parades. Liberation is not always deliverance. The mind, conditioned to obey, cannot instantly relearn chaos. In captivity, the world had boundaries. In peace, those boundaries dissolved. The struggle to adapt became a private war fought in kitchens and marketplaces rather than trenches. By the mid-1950s, Germany had transformed. Factories roared again, streets brightened, and children laughed where ashes once lay. The former POWs aged quietly among the millions rebuilding the new republic. Few spoke of their years in America, but the habits lingered in small gestures. The way they folded flags at civic ceremonies, the punctuality they demanded in schools, and the measured politeness that baffled younger generations. Unwittingly, they had carried fragments of the camp's order into the heart of modern Germany. Decades later, when historians interviewed survivors, one woman said softly, "We learned freedom from those who held us captive." Her words captured the essence of the paradox that scholars would later explore in Journal of Military Ethics. Volume 9, 2003. The German female POW's refusal of freedom was not born of treachery or weakness. It was born of trauma reshaped by compassion. In the ruins of ideology, kindness had become the only stable reality. To leave it felt like stepping back into madness. Historians now call this phenomenon protective captivity, the condition in which safety, even within restraint, outweighs the terror of uncontrolled liberty. It is a rare but revealing mirror of human endurance under absolute upheaval. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell, a documentary crew from Hamburg sought out surviving former POWs. They found a few elderly women living in quiet suburbs, their photographs of Iowa and Kansas still preserved in small boxes. One held up an image of herself at 21, standing before a wooden barack with snow at her boots. "That was the first time I felt safe," she told the camera. The statement, captured 40 years after the war, carried no bitterness, only a fragile gratitude. The fence in the photograph was visible behind her, gleaming faintly in sunlight. The irony endures in the history of warfare. Captivity, when governed by justice, can become a sanctuary for the defeated. It challenges the notion that freedom alone defines dignity. For those German women, The American camps had offered a temporary illusion of normal life amid the wreckage of civilization. Their refusal of freedom was, in truth, a refusal to abandon stability for chaos, to trade known kindness for unknown liberty. They had been broken by war, and the cage, unexpectedly merciful, had given them time to heal. Today, their story survives in fragments, military logs, faded letters, and whispered memories that drift between nations. It remains a quiet testament to the moral dimension of victory, to the idea that humanity in triumph can reshape even the hearts of the conquered. And in that reflection lies the enduring paradox of modern war, that sometimes the truest freedom is not the moment one walks beyond the wire, but the moment one learns compassion on either side of it. As one former prisoner wrote in her final journal before her death in 1978, dramatized. We were released, but not ready. Because before freedom can begin, the soul must first learn to trust the world again.